Okay, come on. There we go. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Shawn Levy. He is the author of a book that came to my attention. It looked very interesting. As somebody who lived in Los Angeles, it was definitely a fascinating story. The title of the book is The Castle on Sunset: Life, Death, Love, Art, and Scandal at Hollywood's Chateau Marmont, which is the story of a very prominent hotel in the city of LA, Chateau Marmont, that kind of reminds me of kind of a West Coast Chelsea hotel in New York. Kind of so many important cultural, political figures. Many people have gone through there through the years, and since it was built just before the crash of 1929. But he's also the author of many other books. One is Dolce Vita, Confidential, Fellini, Lauren, Pucci, Paparazzi, and the Swinging High Life of Nero, A Life, which kind of ties into this story. The Rat Pack, Paul Newman, A Life, The Last Playboy, High Life of Porfirio Rubirosa, and Ready, Steady, Go, The Smashing Rise and Giddy Fall of Swinging London, Rat Pack Confidential, and King of Comedy, The Life and Art of Jerry Lewis. So he's an accomplished author, and I'm delighted that he's taken time out of his schedule to talk about this book. So, Mr. Levy, are you there?
I am. Hi.
Hi. Well, I'm thankful that you decided to do this interview. I know we took a little time to kind of figure out a date, but for people who don't know your name, can you talk a little bit about yourself and what led you to the subject of Chateau Marmont?
I'm. You mentioned all the books. I've been publishing books since 1997, and for about 10 years earlier than that, from the late 1980s on, I was a film magazine writer and editor and a film critic at a daily newspaper in Portland, the Oregonian, from 1997 to 1992, pardon me, to 2012. And I was a critic on TV. And you mentioned the books I've written, and I wrote a book about the Rat Pack in early 60s, late 50s Vegas. I wrote a book about Rome in the 50s, which was a real pop culture melting pot. I wrote a book about London in the 60s. So I always wanted to write a book about the Sunset Strip, which to me, you go Rome, Rat Pack, London, Sunset Strip. And so for about 20 years or so, I've been gathering string on stories of it. And Chateau Marmont's right in the middle. And when I was seeking a new book project in 2016, I proposed my Sunset Strip book again, which I have done many times over the years. And the editors who I'd worked with at Doubleday, they weren't keen on it, but they said, "What about the Chateau Marmont?" So they had taken my proposal and boiled it down to one subject, and the whole book appeared in my head at once. Chateau Marmont is uniquely situated physically, culturally, historically, and I wanted to tell the story of the Sunset Strip, and I could tell a good 50-60% of that book in telling the story of this hotel. Plus, I had this incredible treasure trove of historical stories, gossip, curiosities. So it was a very rich subject, and I saw it immediately when it was suggested.
Yeah, and it really is a centerpiece. It's located right there off the Sunset Strip, right in between kind of the lower part of Hollywood and the Hollywood Hills. And it's very prominent, it's distinctive in its architecture. Can you talk about how the conceptualization and how even the hotel itself was built?
Yeah, it was Sunset Boulevard was an unpaved road in the 1920s, and a speculative builder named Fred Horowitz bought a piece of land just outside the Los Angeles city limits. If you drive west on Sunset Boulevard from downtown, past the Hollywood freeway, it's basically a grid like Manhattan. It's a checkerboard. And you go through Los Angeles and Hollywood, and then you get to the line where Los Angeles city proper ends. And beyond that was the Sunset Strip. Horowitz bought like the first plot of land that was available on the west side of that border where the road starts to curve. And he bought a promontory and he put on it a castle. Basically, he was in love with a chateau that he'd seen in France, which happens to be where Leonardo da Vinci is buried. And he wanted his architect to reproduce it in small form on this hillside. Again, it's an unpaved road. The city of West Hollywood exists virtually in name only. Um, and it's right there, like the Rock of Gibraltar. It's at the beginning of something. The road changes, the culture changes. West Hollywood was a wild town. It became a place of roadhouses and illegal gambling dens and after hours joints. So here's Chateau Marmont with 1 foot in Los Angeles and 1 foot in this bohemian new little village that still, as I say, wasn't paved.
Right, and it's right there just west of Laurel Canyon Drive, right? And
Hmm.
so there's a lot of history there. And also at that time, you mentioned in your book, the Strip it was kind of a name of like honky tonk bars. So the Sunset Strip always had that history of kind of a Wild West element to it. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. It, it, that neighborhood, there were mansions off the road, but they were to the south. To the north, it was still the. If you're going west on Sunset Boulevard, everything to the right until you got to Beverly Hills was farmland, onion fields and poinsettia groves and things like this. So whatever was built there, it wasn't policed by either Beverly Hills or Los Angeles police. It was policed by LA County sheriffs who were most of the time they spent on the other side of the metropolis. So it was kind of lawless. Gangsters operated there. The gangster Mickey Cohn owned a haberdashery on Sunset Boulevard in the 40s and was bombed. And there was a shootout on the street in front of his store. So it's always been kind of like this in between place and crazy place. Later on, it became a haven for Los Angeles's queer community, and it still is, like West Hollywood.
True.
It's still a remarkable place, and the Sunset Strip grew as the center of that city.
Yeah, and there was always kind of this that element. You mentioned a place called the Garden of Allah, which doesn't exist, but that was also kind of a bohemian, bacchanalia kind of debauched place as well. Can you talk a little bit about that and its tie into Chateau Marmont?
Yeah, the Garden of Allah was the first sort of Hollywood no-tell hotel, high-end no-tell hotel in the industry. It was on the estate of the silent movie actress and stage diva Allah,
Nazimova.
pardon me, Allah Nazimova. Allah Nazimova. I'm going to try to give you a cut there.
It's a tough one, yeah, no problem.
Yeah. You've read the book more recently than me, that's for sure.
That's okay.
But I've always had struggled with her name, so I'm gonna turn to a
But
page and have it in front of me.
but it was like there were that she kind of had this uh, theme of small little places. Marx was there, Bogart,
Yeah.
Flynn,
No,
just
I
a
just
bunch of
it,
scandalous people.
it was built on the estate of the Russian actress Alla Nazimova, and she was in a lavender marriage with her husband. They each had lovers on the side. They were both queer, bisexual, practicing all kinds of free love. She surrounded herself with painters and musicians, Igor Stravinsky, Picasso. All these people knew her. And in Los Angeles, she built parking garages and elevators, and every year Marmont was an apartment with a kitchen and a living room and at the very least a small suite with a kitchenette. That's how people live in West Hollywood. And
Right, and I think that's interesting because most people would built originally as an apartment building, not a hotel. So it was
right,
transformed later.
yeah, not for a hotel. Who would build a hotel on a dirt road? It was to put scale apartments mainly to the out of town wealthy trade. Most of the people he figured he would rent apartments to bloods from Santa Barbara and Pasadena and San Francisco who wanted Los Angeles the way Russian and Chinese apartments in Manhattan. And that was the original idea, but he cut the ribbon on the place 7 months before the stock market crashed in 1929, and even those wealthy people stopped looking for apartment rentals. he sold it to a man who hotel, Alfred E. Smith, the movie business, who had become a later after selling his company to Warner Brothers, and that a hotel was a better. This Burbank or Culver City, West LA, every movie and TV facility really conveniently. Um, he understood the movie to stay in a place like this, so he turned it into a successful business as a hotel.
And I mean, at very early stages, there were very famous people who wanted to stay there, namely Billy Harlow. Can you talk a little bit about them?
Yeah, from Horowitz sells in 1933 on celebrities and European and English and New York film people who became accustomed to the place. And peachy. It was funky. Even when it was new, they ran out of money for furnishings, so it was furnished in cheap. After when the depression closing people's mansions, Alfred Smith, the hotelier of the place, bought up estate furniture. So it was furnished in like antiques that didn't match, kind of not Hollywood. If you wanted the ambassador, these were big hotels on beautiful, lush grounds. Chateau Marmont, swimming pool. It was a single building. It didn't have common spaces like a hotel, lobby areas or a restaurant or bar. So people who went there liked it because it was sort of like a bolt hole, and it was you would run into people. They found one another there, and so you wind up with first comes from Europe, escaping the Chateau Marmont, European pension. Jean Harlow, who was sort of the 1930s, a sex pot in the Marilyn Monroe vein. Um, being on, she was about 22 years old. It was her third marriage. During the honeymoon, having affairs with other men, including Clark Gable, her frequent co-star. Um, Again, that could happen because there were cool about things like this. If you
And
were at a hotel with more public areas, so it catered to that crowd who wanted to be near the game, but in a private.
it hasn't changed that much. I mean, I think that repetitiveness and also kind of an insider's place really has stayed the same all the way up until this day. So that was the way it was. That they didn't have kind of the massive amount of like whatever kind of that. And then what developed after like the 30s? How did Marmont continue in its development?
Um, Alfred Smith added some bungalows. What had up around the hotel started to be populated by these bungalows. So he incorporated some of the bungalows into the property, and so you had like private place. You were in building, you didn't have to go through it at all. The amenities of a hotel, this. Um, the next owner, Matt Tower, put in the hired more bungalows and built a couple of bungalows. So there was one other bungalow addition in the 1970s, and that's it. You have a building with 41 rooms, and you have 22 rooms. Gosh,
Right. And it's actually a big. I mean, it's surprising
yeah.
that there are few, you know,
But remember the tiny ones, studio. I mean, a small Manhattan sitting area with in the tiniest room in this place. So the units are bigger than the building in a certain sense. The building looks like it would house a lot more units, but because of the amount of space, there are several. Those things are like 3,600 square feet.
It's
That's like
huge. Yeah.
That's two.
Yeah.
You know?
Great. And so how did like the continued development during World War II and post-war, and can you talk about some of the more famous people hiding there?
Tower, who I mentioned, he ruled over the hotel from until the early 1960s. Really became what we think of. Um, an anti. He actually funded the political opposition to Adolf. That's an anti-fascist. If you're banking the guy Hitler, I got to say you're. Um, and he came to America. Uh, he started buying apartment buildings. He was a banker. He had a PhD. He believed in small d democracy, human freedom, and civil rights. He decided that Chateau Marmont would be accepting of not anything goes, but like with respect and dignity, you'll be treated. You would have your privacy, but you also didn't carry on. He let 1948 became a hate, and Anthony Perkins, and began a. That's where Nicholas Ray made Rebel Without a actor who was sleeping with his underage male and female co-stars, Natalie and Sal Mineo, preying on them. That's who had children. These children. But during that time, he lived there for 8 years, and he made movies while he was there, including Rebel Without a Cause. And one of the ways that movie came about was Chateau Marmont was in Hollywood, and screenwriter pool in Nick Ray's bungalow. He created a milieu there. Um, During this same time, actors started to come from New York. Marlon basically consummated their romance. Newman was a married man with 3 children when he met Joanne Woodward, and was where they acted on this passion that had developed between them, and was this. So it was always fascinating characters. Tell on the West Side, actually, and that meant jazz musicians started to stay there. Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, Duke Ellington was at an amazing story to happen in 20 years.
Yes. There's tons of movies you talk in the book that are they're Inception, Marmont, so Butch Cassidy, all these.
Screenwriters, the other secret was that it was cheap. People knew where you were staying, but you weren't spending money, so you could stay there for months. I mentioned Nicholas Ray stayed in a bungalow for 8 years. It was his home. People would go there and write 2 scripts in 9 months. Um, Rooms on retainer, and they kept cars. Rick De Niro did that for years in the 19. He there that was his. I think they could get permission from him to use it for other, A-list guests. Of their 63 rooms, they dedicated one to this guy.
Wow, that's incredible. It wasn't. Oh, I mean, of the hotel itself, there were definitely some
Oh,
DK elements.
well, I mean, It's particularly some zoning to change. There was going to be a freeway built through Hollywood connecting the Bay, Southern California stretch of La Cienega through the Baldwin Hills that feels like a freeway. That was part of that projected freeway. And it would come right up Laurel Canyon. That land would have been worth a lot more. It would have been a freeway interchange.
Interesting. I wasn't
some,
aware of that.
yes, we could have replaced Chateau Marmont, but through these guys didn't invest in the hotel at all. It was being used. Also, the rise of rock and roll, the Sunset Strip had all the rock bands on it. So, in in addition to the movie clientele and the people from advertising and fashion who always Marmont, you start this people. Rock brings in a there's just a whole nother level of debauchery. You know, it's fueled, stronger than booze and you know
Right.
you get Led Zeppelin staying there. They didn't drive motorcycles. There is no lobby. That happened at Set Marquee. Um,
Like a lot of
yeah,
used
yeah.
yeah, right.
Um, yeah, during this time, the hotel got grungy. And it was still cheap like for a reason, like in your hands. You turn the shower on and the knob would come. So tear it down. A builder, a guy from Charlotte. This building was on the auction block 66, and the reserve wasn't met. Like that's how low in esteem it was at that time.
That's
Um,
incredible.
about 10 years after that, there's still like it churns through a series of four or five makeshift corporations with you know one-time deal to tell them see if they could sell it or tear it down. And it went through being divorced. He moves in. It's like a bachelor pad. It's Armand for being the place kicked out of the house, and he falls in love with the place, and he decides he's going to restore it. And he kind of shores it up and saves it from rack and ruin. It had been neglected. It was never luxurious under Sarlot, but it was still cheap, and it was saved. He was like the ER, the thing alive. Um,
Right.
but during
And
that time,
please
the
continue. Go ahead.
Polanskis are staying there, and they into Cielo Drive because Sharon Tate doesn't want to bring a. She dies there. He's been staying, carrying on for weeks, months, using hard drugs, abusing his body, abusing his career, and no one can stop. Sarlot saw a lot going to maintain some of the ideals that the hotel has always had of tolerance and discretion.
Gotcha. And so, what's the true story of Jim Morrison on the roof or on the balcony?
Oh, there is a true story. That's one of the learned in this book. Like the day or two after this happened, there was an article about in the LA Times telling this story. That's totally credible to me. Jim Morrison got kicked out of the Riot House, this house down the street, which had been built by Gene Autry, the Cowboy star. He would be on upper floor, one balcony to another, very high, drunk, on LSD, out of his skull, and he would do Boulevard. This was a time, by the way, he'd run out into traffic with his coat and like be a mad Sunset Boulevard. So he gets to Marmont. He's in a bungalow that has an upstairs and a downstairs. Same trick. in great shape, and something came loose, or he lost his grip. At any rate, he fell and he hit little Eve, the little over the doorway, and then garden below it, and he wound up injured, but didn't break his neck. Yeah. And then 2 days later, this guy who was at the party saw this thing. Jim Morrison is still a reporter for the LA, in a historic true.
Gotcha. And so, I mean, it went through kind of a downward phase, and then there was a reascent.
Well, in the 70s, Morrison's, Belushi's 83. Some Roman Polanski stayed there again after Sharon Tate's murder when he was about to flee his sentencing. And the charges are still open against him for.
Yeah, I think he's a convict. He's a convict.
He's
He just
fugitive.
wasn't sentenced.
Yeah, time, but not all of the time. He probably under the. That was the last before he fled the country.
Oh, interesting.
And Sarlat owns this place 1990-ish, and then he sells it. He and his partner are splitting up their hotel for 15 years. He had other, but he rescued it. Then he sells it to a guy, the current owner, Andre Bala, who's the heir to a biomedical fortune made by his Hungarian dad, who made. And
he's kind of like.
Balaj is a man about town. His wife, Ford, heir of the Ford modeling business and fortune. So he was in the fashion world, in politics as a young man, then a nightclub owner, and then years he's been engaged to Chelsea Handler with his wife. Balaj is 60s. His wife is about 30. They have a baby who's about. His $1 million apartment, and he says basically it's just a story. So he's getting rid of it.
Yeah.
So, and his thing is, he's their hotels, the Mercer Hotel in Manhattan, still owns the hotels in London and on Long Island. He has owned the Standard Hotel chain, kind of hipster, high end. Los Angeles, New York, Miami. He helped found those, and that company is no longer part of it. Chateau Marmont up. If you walk into Chateau Marmont today, it is gorgeous. Of a heyday that it never actually had. It's like you are to come around the corner. Full time, it feels luxurious, but it never was luxurious. He's pulled off this feat of press. You're seeing never existed, but it's beautiful and it's tasteful and it existed. Built it as a luxury hotel. He put in a restaurant. He got the first liquor license. He started hosting parties and poetry readings, book launches, and art shows. It's the place to go to get your makeup on Oscar night or get your hair done before the Grammys, because certain beauty concerns. Floors of it, of awards season, and it's expensive. Nick Ray, for 8 years tonight. If you close, pre-pandemic
Wow.
There's no way the Bohemians have been priced out Bohemians, but it's not the same. And it's a great job that he did. He made it lucrative. He made it a global brand. Sold off some of the heritage to get to that level. It's there only as uh, it's a best live.
Like a
Yeah, yeah,
spectral. But is it turn it into a private club or turn it into some type of
yeah.
front, front or
He's
whether
had a
that
really lousy year press wise. He responded to the pandemic. It's a privately owned hotel, so we don't know. It used it and back in March. Discussion that he fired them because there were quirks of the California labor laws and the unions. Some people say he's trying to break the union. At any rate, he let everybody go. There are a few long term guests who have been bubbled, quarantined in the hotel, increased over the, um, but most has hired back a portion of the workforce. But there were people like 30 years. And, in a hotel with that devoted a clientele, something. A lot of people got angry with him. He botched that. Then he announced, and tone deaf in the middle of the economic hardship and uncertainty that we're all living through, he announced that he was going to basically turn shares. He would be the only way you could stay in the hotel would be if you were a member of the hotel. Um, there would still be public places. Sure, there would be a certain number of rooms. Tina Brown or Tom Cruise Jones wants to stay at Chateau Marmont. But in the main private people, now as I say, it's the smallest room in the place is probably about a year ago would have cost you about a night, maybe $500 a night, and that would be for like
right.
and but not as big around you, that's for sure. Um, and you know, basically turned it into a anyhow.
Right. There,
Except there could be new people coming in, and it's a way for him to generate income when the hotel business is completely flatlining. Um, to really, he's doing that at the fighting employees in the legislature and in the courts about unionizing and getting back wages and having against employers who are so capricious. So it was a really poor response, that
gotcha.
announcement, and it remains to be seen if people will do it. I'm sure there are people with money to throw away who would like to stay at Chateau Marmont, but they may not feel the same when they see how he behaved about it.
Of the Marmont, whether it's able to form it, but development, there's
Yeah,
higher end things. So storm.
torn down in like 1960, replaced with a kind of modern standing up for destroyed. The only was a model of the place in the lobby of the bank, and now
Wow.
someone's built a modern Frank Gehry tower with entertainment in the lower floors and rooms reaching up into the sky. Right, and the preservationists stood up for the mid-century. So
Wow.
it into the design for that building, but that shows you how long seriously, they may not have the 1960s they do today. And so because of that, Chateau Marmont's a registered landmark of the city.
Fascinating.
And it's always has done with it that none of the previous Starlot saved it from falling a brand. Turn it back into a hotel. If we know anything about this place, it's adaptable.
It's an apartment building.
Now it's luxurious.
Yeah.
They added to it, a bona built on the double poured concrete because of and it wound up all.
I think part of your book, little surviving one of the early like that. So.
Yeah. There are stories of because when an earthquake, out of towners so connect and earthquakes.
Anything that you'd like to end up on, or anything you would like? Where can people find your book? Copies? Do you have a website?
I have a website, Shawn Levy, ShawnLevy.com. Not the Stranger Things and all that stuff. Every day I am.
Okay.
And all Barnes and Noble, IndieBound is where you can buy them from bookstores near you. It's a nice thing. I think we learned in this year businesses mean a lot to us.
Sure.
Worth noting also that this book is in development at Paramount Television under the production banner.
All right.
In this world of Chateau
Great.
Marmont.
That gets green lighted, and we can watch that on. I mean, this would be a good intro to that future show. And do you have any projects in the future you'd like to? Still kind of hush hush.
No. I'm working on two books that'll be released in 2021. One is a poems from a Portland, Oregon publisher where I live, based on a year's worth of their ovations and who news, and that was 26, and that was the year we lost and Arnold Palmer and David Bowie and Leonard Cohen, Glenn, Fidel Castro. It was really Prince. It was a year, and so it's a bunch of mini biographies. And for Doubleday, a history of pioneers of stand-up comedy. So Maisels.
Great. Well, that sounds great. I'll keep an eye out for that. So, Shawn Levy, and the book is The Castle on Sunset: Life, Death, Love, Art, and Scandal at Hollywood's Chateau Marmont. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for your interest.
All right, Shawn. Take care. Have a good one. Let's see if you're still there.